You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy Gamer.
And I'm Norm. Okay, so today we will be talking about the gloomy board game, This War of Mine. And as we're talking about This War of Mine, we also want to raise the topic of board games which aim to educate on a difficult theme. So a quick warning, as we go through this episode, we're going to be talking about some darker themes like war, potentially other difficult themes like colonialism, and maybe even slavery. So if these themes are something you're sensitive to and don't wish to hear about, then you might want to sit out this episode.
Yep, so just to give a basic overview for anyone who hasn't played before, This War of Mine is set in a war-torn world in which you act as the guide to a small group of 3 survivors, whose goal is simply to survive and wait for rescue. The game takes place over a number of rounds, each round representing a day in the game. During setup, players will create a deck with 3 chapter cards situated throughout. Alongside this event deck is 3 objective cards. During each of the 3 chapters, players will aim to complete these objectives before the next chapter card is drawn for a reward, or face a punishment if they fail to do the objective. The game ends either when the final objective has been completed, or if all survivors are eliminated due to starvation, depression, illness, or being wounded. Accompanying the game is a book of scripts with hundreds of varied events which can be triggered at different times, and all of which tell some kind of story relevant to the survivors and the situations, usually horrors of war, they must deal with. The game board features a house whose spaces represent the different rooms in the house, as well as locations nearby which are available to scavenge during play. During setup, the house's rooms are populated with cards which can offer resources when explored or act as barriers to the rest of the house until removed. Days are split into different phases which indicate the time of day. So we have morning, day, dusk, evening, night, and finally dawn. During these phases, various things happen and resources can be gained or lost, and survivors' mental and physical states will be altered depending on the player's choices and random events. After the dawn phase, a new day starts and the game structure repeats until the game ends. That's a basic overview of the game there. Did I miss it?
Yeah, I think you've done a terrific job. I I don't think you're missing anything off of the top of my head. I think that's exactly what I would have said as well. Before we dive into how we feel about This War of Mine, very quickly for you guys, the listeners, as you're already aware, if you've listened to any of our shows before, Scruffy normally does a YouTube playthrough that is released in tandem with the episode, so you can see how the game works in more detail. He hasn't done it this episode, though, and Scruffy, I was just wondering if you would be able to tell the listeners a little bit about your decision-making and why you have chosen not to do that this time.
Yeah, so basically, I started recording the video, as I do every time, and I realised partway through, this is not how the game is meant to be experienced. Like, if you were watching it, or even just for me playing it and trying to present as I was playing it, it didn't work at all. Because the kind of nature of the game is this kind of immersive world where you're wrapped in the narrative, and there's a lot of reading for a start, which is always very difficult to film. But it's meant to, I think, invoke a sense of isolation, and to some extent, I think it's meant to move beyond a pleasant, light-hearted, or even puzzly strategic experience and game, and into something a little bit more personal. And it felt really weird trying to record that and upload it for an audience. I don't think much of the ethos of the game would have come across when watching me play it and reading out, so blah, blah, blah. This means that you have to look at this event, and the event says, we discover a dead body. Oh, okay. I mean, it just felt so wrong and at odds with the ethos of the game, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I think I support your decision 100%. If you didn't feel like it was right, then it's not right. So that's absolutely fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I went ahead and finished a playthrough of the game, obviously, for preparation for the show and to see if I could make it to the end. I am still yet to succeed and keep the survivors alive. We had another dismal end in our game. And I think you played it a game too, is that right?
That is correct. And it's another, this is another caveat I just want to make listeners aware of. That was my first and only time playing the game. So Scruffy is more experienced with this one than I am. So do take my opinions with a little bit of a pinch of salt. It's more of a first impressions than a analysis of the game itself.
Did you win? Did your guys survive?
Oh yeah,
Really?
no.
You had me going there. I've never. I got really quite far this time. I got to like the end of the second chapter. We were about to draw the third chapter card, but something happened.
Yeah, it was around midway through the second chapter that we lost our last survivor. So
I saw you start it up. I was teaching you how to play, and saw you do the first round. I remember you took a baby into your shelter, didn't you? Another mouth to feed. Just you couldn't leave them there when you were out scavenging, so you brought a baby home. Did that work out all right?
no, it didn't work out all right. But that brings up something I do want to talk about that the game I think does really well. The game is kind of a masterclass in getting players invested emotionally in their characters and in the story. Much more so, you already said this is a game that's meant to be experienced rather than sort of puzzled out and and win and be a strategy game. It's definitely that as well. It's so challenging that it does. I can see people wanting to come back and just try to win, but it's not really the intention of the game. And one thing that I really enjoyed is when I found that baby, it really, I can see how well it was designed because I immediately became invested. One of the things it did is when I read through the card, it said, you've found this baby, you don't have to bring back, you could left it, but it wasn't right for that character to do so because they had quite high empathy. If I were to fail my empathy check, it would have done bad things. So I took the baby, and it said, "Now you've taken a baby, you must name it." And wow, that changes everything. Now that I can name something, once you name something, you then have something to lose,
Yeah.
And from a design point of view, that's so clever, giving the player something that they care about to lose straight away. Because that happened right at the beginning of the game.
I should point out as well that resources in this War of Mine are so scarce. Like, that is the kind of main antagonist of the game, I think, is not only trying to keep your people alive and free from harm and wounds and stuff, but trying to keep them just basically fed. I mean, right at the start of the game, during setup, your three survivors start off hungry,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, start with a little bit of food, but that's only enough for one day. Then you've got to go and get more. And you can't, it's very hard to generate food. You have to go scavenging for it. That's the only real way to get it. Maybe you'll find a bit in the house, in a bit of furniture and stuff, but that's hard to get to. And oh my God, it's impossible to keep everyone alive and healthy and well. And I guess having that baby there as well, wow, that must have made decisions become at some point a choice between, do I let the baby go hungry or do I let my survivor go hungry? What do I do?
Yeah, and I was always terrified to let the baby go hungry. And I think one of the reasons why is because, like I said earlier, it's because I named it. My loss aversion would have been triggered if you are listening, you don't know about loss aversion. Jeff Engelstein, the designer of The Expanse, amongst many other board games, and the former host of the Ludology podcast, speaks about it in length. He actually does a seminar on his YouTube channel, which I'll link in the description. But the basic idea of loss aversion is that it feels worse to lose something than it feels good to gain something. And there's a very basic example where people always gamble to avoid a loss rather than to gain something. So people always gamble to avoid a loss, even if it's not mathematically sensible to do so. And you can, like I said, please watch his seminar for more information because it's really, really interesting to know. And a lot of designers are aware of this, and it's the reason why you see in Euro games that people won't have things taken from them. So it's interesting to see this War of Mine immediately gave me something I was afraid to lose because it wanted me invested on an emotional level. It wanted me to be afraid of feeling bad when I lose that thing. So it's very clever.
I guess that's one of the reasons the game feels so miserable, is that every day you have a night raid, and every night raid you lose some of your stores, some of the stuff that you've got in your store. You have to. I mean, it's almost impossible to avoid it unless you've got a lot of investment in guards. I mean, I boarded up my house to try and make it secure and stuff and prevent that from happening, but you do just lose some stuff, and that's depressing.
It is. It feels bad from a player's point of view, not even in the story. From a player's point of view, it feels bad to have things taken from you.
Even if you're not using them right now. Like I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll lose this book or this mechanical part I'm not really using, but I might have needed that. You know, there's something really innate, like you were saying, about loss and how it makes you feel as a player to lose resources. It feels like you're taking a real step back, even though then scavengers come back with a big load of resources if they've had a lucky scavenge. You still it doesn't make up that you just lost something.
Yeah, and I appreciate that's the game's intention. The game's intention is to get you invested on an emotional level rather than having your normal gamer hat on to just play through and try to win. Because you can correct me if you feel any different, but I certainly got the feeling that the intention of this War of Mine was to show the player the human cost of war.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there are some specific events. Like one example is when I was out scavenging, something happened, and whenever something happens in the game, it's like called a reality check or something. You just get a random event that you look up in the scripts. And I had this one thing where my character just avoided a trap that was set there by another person, and it was quite a big trap. And it gave me the two options: you can either dismantle the trap or leave it and hope you catch something, some food. And I was desperate for food, so I left the trap. And then at the end of the scavenging, you come back to it, and it says it resolves. It says, okay, so here's what happened. And what happened is there was no animal caught or anything, no food. It was just somebody had left a note saying, thanks for that. You nearly made my someone's name, lose their leg, you jerk.
Wow.
It's just like, yeah, that's something that could have happened and might have happened in actual real life. Like, it's a decision that you don't think you'd ever make, but even within a game, you make that decision. Oh, it's fucking horrible. It's horrific.
It really is horrific. That's a really good word for the game. It's dark and it's depressing, but because you become because you become invested in the game and these characters and you want them to survive, you kind of go into it knowing that that's difficult. The game has a reputation that they're not going to survive. And that kind of makes you even that kind of meta makes you root for them even more. I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because on turn 2, I stepped out of the house in order to try and make contact with other visitors, hoping I'd maybe get a fourth survivor, because you can have up to 4 survivors in your house. And I thought, more hands? Good, be great, let's try and do that. And there's a 1 in 10 chance when you do that your character will just get shot and really injured. And that happened to me on turn 2. And from a player's point of view there, I was kind of checked out of that character at that point. But then later on, they managed to get healed up and they were doing really well and recovering. And then just 2 days in a row, they couldn't have a cigarette. And they got depressed by that, and depressed to the point of suicide. And just that I was like, I'd gone through this arc with them of being like, straight away, checked out, not interested in them, to they're finally recovering, and something really good had just happened, and they've recovered their health, and then immediately they killed themselves, and I was just like, wow, it was a real blow to me as a player. Like, it was horrible.
No, no, it is, and that's something that we haven't yet mentioned, is that the characters don't just have statistics; they also have like basic needs that you kind of have to try to fulfill because people need to feel human. They're not; these aren't just workers you're managing and placing them in places. I had a character who, if they didn't have coffee at a certain time, by a certain time of each round, then they would become more miserable because that was their habit. They needed a coffee. And it really helps you understand what this person is, who this person is, I should say.
It's worth pointing out as well that they don't have one need. It's that it happens a random choice between up to three. So you can accommodate for it to some extent, but that day they might actually fancy not coffee, but they might have had another thing. Like they just wanted, I think that person specifically, I think I had her in my game as well. And she wanted to make sure that she had such high empathy that she'd get more miserable if the other survivors were hungry.
Yeah,
And
and it
so
makes
she
sense.
got coffee that day, but if you'd not accounted for the other thing that might upset her, then yeah.
Yeah, you can get hit by one or the other. You don't know which one it's going to be, and every round is framed by going through 24 hours, and it kind of that's what it's like. You take every day as it comes. When you're going through something difficult, you do take it day by day as from a as a person. So the fact that that's how the game's structured and framed as well, and in the first round it was the coffee thing that upset her, but in the second round it might have been the hunger thing that upset her, and that's because it's a different day and she was feeling different that day. And I think that's a really clever piece of design because it really brings the game to life.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to quickly say that I mentioned earlier my character killed themselves, and that there are other ways of dying as well. You can die from being too wounded or too ill, and every single death has its own specific epilogue, and there are sometimes multiple different ones. So the epilogue will tell you to go to the book of scripts, and that will be direct you to the characters specific one, and so you get this kind of conclusion to their story which is personal to that character. And yeah, it just makes you, because there's a temptation in board games to strip everything down to its mechanics, and when you do that and then you kind of get a loss in this game, you get the kind of pull back to, well, here's the human consequence of it, the non-mechanical consequence. Not only removing that character from the game, you're down survivor, but also you have to hear this little story about who they were and how their story ended.
And you do get to know who the people are because there are events where they sometimes you draw up a memory, and you have to resolve depending on their emotional state. You have to resolve a memory, and you go to the book of scripts, and it tells you something they remember about their past. And that's really interesting for character development. You really begin to understand their motivations and why they have these basic needs. And I thought it was interesting how it's depending on their emotional state. You draw a memory and it says if their misery level is 0 to 1, then look at these numbers and draw roll a die and resolve either of those pages. If their misery is 2 to 3, then you're going to need to roll a die and resolve these pages. And depending on how they're doing from the choices that you've made or the random events in the gameplay that you've watched, you get to see how it affects them. Just not even if something big happens like them dying, even if it's just something small like they're feeling somewhat nostalgic and thinking about their past, you might see exactly what kind of rotten mood they are, and that reflects in what they're thinking about. I don't think I've seen that in any other game, any other board game anyway that I've played ever.
Yeah, it really does stand out as pretty unique, because it goes so full on not just a mechanical tie-in to the story, but just the story and the story going a whole nother level. I feel like usually you might get random events in games that come up, and you might have a book of scripts. So thinking of things like Tales of Arabia, for example, which is just a chaotic nightmare of scripts. You
Yeah.
make choices, you end up doing a random thing, and they feel very, very disconnected from your characters. But this one having specific scripts for specific characters, as well as general ones for things that just happen to your survivors. But those general ones also usually then tying back to, okay, roll and then look at one of your character's statistics and determine what happens based on their empathy or whatever.
And it feels very organic. The best way I can describe the way the game incorporates the book of scripts is kind of like if you're playing for a story mode of a video game, and you do a little bit of decision making yourself, and then it goes to a cutscene. That's how it feels when you're playing. That's how I felt. It reminded me of playing
Yeah.
through a story mode of a video game where I've done my little piece of action, and now it cuts to something that I wasn't expecting, and that builds the interest.
It'll be like so there'll be like an event, and then you'll make a choice. Like I had two kids come to my shelter. First choice, they're yelling, "Let us in! One of us is going to die if you don't let us in." Do you let them in? And that's the choice you have: yes or no. Go to a different script. So I chose to let them in because I figure why not? See what happens. Um, and we had a bandage on hand that nobody was using, so I thought maybe we can help these guys out, and so we let them in. Okay, so they've come in. One of them's really injured. Do you offer them a bandage to help them? Try and steal their weapons, or I can't remember what the other one was. Just turn them away or something. And just going through this branching narrative, and then so I chose to obviously bandage them up. That was why I let them in. I thought I'd try and bandage them up, and we did that, and they just went off and said thank you. And all that happened then is you roll um, a black dice, and if it's like if your character's got good empathy, it's likely to increase their misery. Unfortunately, one of my characters had really low empathy, so he didn't mind that they wandered that they done it, and just spent a bandage for nothing. Now, next turn, that specific character got injured, and I was like, "We haven't got a bandage,"
Yeah.
because we just gave it away for no reason, according to him. And I could really imagine that character getting into that mindset just based on those little choices and those little, like you say, cutscenes. You know?
And the cutscenes make a lot more sense than in something like Tales of Arabian Nights, for example, because it depends on what's going on. The cutscene you get depends on what's going on around you. Depends on what location you're in whilst you're scavenging. It depends on the mood of the character potentially. Depends on the level of noise that you've made whilst you're scavenging. All of these things, not all the time, but some of the time they can factor in. You can kind of see, oh yes, that's happened because there was somebody else in the room with me that, and I couldn't see them, and that's why it happened because of things that have happened previously. Everything, it feels like the cutscenes all make sense.
Yeah, it has a really clever system where whenever a reality check happens, depending on whether it comes while you're scavenging or while you're on night duty or while you're there's other ones as well. For example, just during the morning in the events phase, things like that. It will then tell you to draw a card from a colors deck, which is just literally a color, random color. Brilliant. I like that. I don't know why I like that, but it feels nice. And then it will say, okay, now draw the next card in the relevant deck. So if you're scavenging, draw the next card in the exploration deck. While you're on a night raid, draw the next night raid card. It will say it specifically on the reality check card, and then reference the color at the bottom corner of that card. And that will take you to a script that is specifically to do with the time of day you're in.
Yeah, and it feels like because of the way it generates what cutscene that it brings up for you, and because of how natural it feels, the game almost feels like that. Because let's be honest, the game subtracts player agency for story. There
Yeah,
isn't that many meaningful. Well, there are meaningful choices to make, but there aren't that many strategic choices to make. There are a lot of random events that happen,
it
and
doesn't make clear the impact of what the choices will be a lot of the time.
Yeah. So there will be an impact, like you said in your example with the bandages, but it's difficult for you to plan and to strategize around that. So one, you have to be okay with that. But the game, it feels like a story generating machine. You put in this random data and you get a story that makes sense.
It
And
will not be a happy story.
it will never be a happy story, but I don't know if this is a criticism for the game because obviously it's not trying to be a strategic game. But from my perspective, I'm used to playing, strategy games. I did feel like at some points I wasn't playing the game; I was operating the machine. You know, I was
Mm.
inputting the random data to get the story. And if you are a more sort of thinky gamer or a more strategic gamer and you enjoy some other games that we covered like Feast for Odin or maybe even Mage Knight, which does have some strong emergent narrative but not baked in narrative, I think you might struggle with that because it did feel sometimes you have to pick up a card from this part of the board and then go to this part and then roll a dice and resolve this and then open up this book of scripts. It did feel a little bit cumbersome from the way you handle the game. It's a lot to pick up and draw and shuffle and roll and then flip through the book. It was a little bit cumbersome, and I think that's something you should be aware of if you're thinking of giving the game a go.
Yeah, that is absolutely a fair criticism, and to some extent, setting up the game in real life. I mean, we both played on tabletop sim, but I remember it's always a bit of a pain to organize it all and get it all set up. It allows you to save the game. It's got like a system where you can kind of at the end of every day you can kind of just pack it away as is, and you'll be able to reorganize it how it was. So that's a lot of actual physical labor. And that extends beyond just setup and packing away to every time you come from scavenging, you're putting in a lot of stuff into your scavenging pool that you can't even carry home. So it's actual physical actions that have no result, no, because you're going to just put them straight back anyway.
Yeah.
To some extent, that can be a bit frustrating, and I wonder if how much of that is intentional, how much gets in the way of the fun. But again, it's not really a game for fun. I don't think. I think it's a
No.
game to have this, like we've been saying, a narrative experience, and it does that really well. It sacrifices fun for something else, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective on the game.
The game is clearly an educational tool. It reminded me of have you read Mouse, the comic book based on the Holocaust?
Oh no, I keep meaning to. I really want to read that.
One of the things I love about Mouse is it takes an event that is obviously so catastrophically awful that you can't really comprehend how bad it is, and it brings it down to a human level. This is how it impacts an individual person, and this is what they go through. And it reminded me of that, when you hear on the news about countries that are affected by war and civilians that are stuck in a civil war, maybe you hear about numbers in the thousands, and it's difficult to comprehend how sad that is when you hear about it on a macro level. One thing that the game does really well is it scales it down to the micro level. So this is what this individual person has gone through, and you done your best to try and survive, and you weren't able to. So and it does elicit a lot of feelings. Like I said, it does it so well by getting players invested. Gives you things to care about. It takes things away from you all the time, which triggers that loss aversion I mentioned. It's a masterpiece at what it does. But if you are coming at this from for a normal sort of gaming experience, it is not a fun game, and it is not a strategic game, and it is cumbersome and fiddly to set up. So I just think it's worth knowing that, but it's a masterpiece of what it does.
See, that's really interesting. Saying it's not a fun game. We've both been saying that. Obviously, it does give this kind of glimpse into a real situation, and it gives you those kind of gut punches of reality. The card being called reality impact. It's exactly what the scripts are. But I wonder to what extent, and I couldn't work this out for how I feel about it. But I'd love to hear what you think. To what extent do you think that the game is a form of escapism in the exact same way as things like, because obviously it's not set necessarily in a fantasy world, but it's not also set in a specific real location. But to the same in the same way that things like any sort of dark horror, like Cthulhu and things like that, try and give you this sort of ghoulish horror. I wondered to what extent you felt it does that or avoids doing that.
Yeah, I think it avoids it because with those kind of horror games, there's different It doesn't touch any of the conventions of horror, other than that it involves horrible things happening. It doesn't have
Mm.
any of the normal what you would associate with horror in terms of graphic design or artwork, or in my opinion, there's no kind of horror can be kind of campy and oh no, I'm being chased by a tentacle monster, and it's as horrible and gross as that sound. It's kind of fun because it's horrible and gross. This look when I found a child and had to name it and look after it, that is very different to what those kind of Arkham games or other horror games are trying to achieve. So it felt very different. In terms of escapism, I don't think it offers any kind of real escapism other than the fact that when you go into the game, you kind of, like I said earlier, you have that meta of knowing it's difficult to win. So the only thing that I kind of motivated me to keep going and playing is to try and, well, let's see if I can help these guys survive. And you end up rooting for them. And sometimes it does, there are glimpses of it becoming fun when a couple of good things happen in a row, and you kind of think, yes, I might be able to make it. That is the only kind of fun, quote unquote, fun aspect. We're probably gonna, people are, we're probably gonna get a reaction from people saying, "I love this Sword of Mine. I think it's really fun. You guys are so wrong." But I have to be honest. That's what I think. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, just going off that, it made me realize that there is no real catharsis at all. You get endings, you get closure, but you never get that same sort of thing you get with all good horror, which is reaching a point where things are all happening and it gets exciting and explosive, and you get that release, that tension release. It's just tension and then misery. It's just building up. It's much more of a kind of almost artistic piece, it builds up and builds up, and you get tense and you go through a kind of drama. And I think when bad things happen, the only response I really had is to kind of throw my hands up and want to give up and check out, and frame it as kind of, well, it'll be over soon now anyway. And I think that's a very human reaction. I don't know if you felt the same way, where you just sort of check out and just well, now I just want them to die so that the game can be over because I know I'm not going to win. And I think, but then you get a little glimmer of hope, like something good happens, and you go, well, actually, now I really want this character to survive. I had two characters die and one left, and I realized actually now they're dead. Maybe he can go it alone and do it. And he found a friend, a visitor came, and I was reinvested. But then it happened again. And they both died, but it didn't ever feel like there was a release of tension. It just felt dismal.
And that's probably what I think that's what I was trying to say. But yeah, you've absolutely nailed it. So thank you for finding that for me, because I was really struggling to put that into words. But yeah, that it feels different to the traditional horror type games because it isn't one, And one of the reasons is because players go through that cycle of tension and release with horror. With this, there's just tension and you feel bad, and then tension, and then please don't feel worse. Oh, I do feel worse. um, so that's kind of the journey I had with it. And again, take my opinion with a pinch of salt. It was my first time playing the game, but I definitely felt like the game was intended to be an educational tool to show players this is what real people go through. This could easily be a real world setting. These are real life consequences, and for doing that, it's excellent at doing that.
I'm really looking forward to hearing back from people if anyone's succeeded at the game, because neither of us obviously have succeeded at the game. I wonder if you do ever achieve that sense of catharsis, or whether you look back and go, because I don't think there's any way to succeed without something horrible happening, either to your survivors or at least in the events around you, and whether you can look back and be like, we did it, we made it, and you get that feeling, or and then it moves more into a fun thing, or whether you look back and just go, we did it, but at what cost? I wonder how that feels. You'll have to let us know.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was wondering as well is once I finished it, I felt like I said, it's not really a game that I didn't. At some points, I didn't really feel like I was playing. I felt like I was operating the storytelling machine, and I felt like it was a game that had to be experienced rather than played. So for the people that do play the game often and enjoy it and keep coming back to it, yeah, where is the is it because of the challenge, because of how challenging the game is? You want that sense of accomplishment. You want to beat it. What is it that brings you back more than because like Scruffy, you've played it a few times. What is it that brings you back to the game? Because I certainly felt like after one play, I feel like okay, I feel like I've experienced the game. I've got what the designers wanted me to get out of it. I don't feel like I need to go back and see all the other miserable stories that I haven't seen yet. What is it that made you want to play it more than once and keep coming back to it?
So I've played it this time playing it was only my third time, and the reason for that is I think you can't really play it in short succession because you'll get the same scripts eventually. And I noticed in the second playthrough I did, I hit a few of the same scripts, and that kind of breaks the immersion to some extent for me. This time playing through, obviously I'd forgotten all the scripts that I'd hit previously, and I don't know if I hit any similar ones, but it felt if I remember feeling similarly in the other games I've played. It was nice to feel like I got a little bit further, and I think going forward, I might end up playing it again, but only after a lot of time has passed. And I think it's the sort of thing that will be because I own a physical copy of the game, so it's going to be a companion throughout the rest of my life. And maybe one year I'll complete it. Maybe just sort of a once a year game. That might be a way to view it as a once a year experience where you have another crack at this war of mine and see if you can do it.
That's interesting.
Shall we open out a bit from this war of mine now? We've obviously covered that quite a lot.
Yeah, so the topic, as we said at the beginning of the episode, the topic is games that aim to educate on difficult subjects like war, political issues, and social issues. And just very broadly, before we dive into that, Scruffy, how do you feel about games looking to teach a lesson or educate in that context? Do you think it's very broadly, first of all, do you think it's they're a good tool for that, or how do you feel about that?
So this has really brought up doing the research for this episode and thinking about this topic. It's really brought up an issue for me with board games and thrown a kind of spotlight on the choice of theme in board games. And I feel like there are kind of two types of games with problematic themes. You have ones that use the theme and link it with the tone of the game and use it to make an actual meaningful statement about social issues like this war of mine and unpack the issue, or even just start as a discussion point for it, or even just draw light to a social issue. And I think that's a really good reason to use a problematic theme in the game. And then there's ones that just seem to have the theme with no real meaningful reference. And sometimes not even mechanical tie-ins, so it doesn't even make sense mechanically linked with the game. It's just that they are painted with a problematic theme. And I've kind of started to ask myself, well, why do designers choose to do that then? Because that's not just something that happens. The example that kind of sprung to mind for this was things like Puerto Rico, where you take the role of a kind of colonial plantation owner, and for the rest of the game, it's not brought up or referenced or tied into the mechanics. I mean, you could just as easily be a gardener with, the different types of crops in your garden, and it would mechanically work the same. The game would function the same. So why have they chosen that theme? I wonder where you are with all that.
It's definitely an interesting topic, and board games are unusual in that way. There aren't video games set in, colonial times that just ignore the fact that that is a setting. But there are many board games that do that, and I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe it's something that was okay, but it's not. It's not a. You mentioned Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a relatively older game. It's still a modern game, obviously, but it's a few years old, but it's still going on. I mean, one of the most popular games that can be played solo of 2019 was Alexander Pfister's Maracaibo, which is about colonizing in the Caribbean. And again, it's not something that is important in the game. The theme is not important, so it seems unusual that they use that. You mentioned there were two games, or two different types of games with problematic themes. One, like this War of Mine, where they heavily lean into that to make a statement on, how maybe the player should feel about that, and then the other, which is what we've just been speaking about. I would also say that there is a third kind of game, which is where the problematic theme is very important and done very accurately, but there's no kind of emotional level. And when I say those, I mean like the history games, the historical games. Like the GMT War games. Set in, like, for example, there's a solo. Well, it's not just solo, but it is a game you can be played solo, which is Labyrinth: A War on Terror, and it's set in now. There are events that happen in that game that have happened within our lifetime. As a player, you have to go through them, but it's not done for the same reason that this War of Mine is. It's just there. And I think those are very interesting as well, because although they might not be emotive, people who play those games certainly have a lot more respect and understanding of the events that occurred than people who play, for example, Maracaibo. People who play Labyrinth, War and Terror will have a better understanding of the events that happened than people who play Maracaibo would when it comes to colonizing in the Caribbean, assuming that those games are their only source of knowledge for those subjects.
Yeah, I mean, I think with those games, the only experience I've had was with a war game like that was Silent Victory.
Yeah.
So in Silent Victory, you play in a submarine in World War Two, and I think the reason the theme works to some extent in that game is because the tone of the game is almost like a historical text. I'm not sure how I feel about war games at the moment. I'm very new to the genre, and I'm sure there might be some problematic titles out there. It felt really quite strange when I played that, having because your goal is to go and sink ships, and having the names of the ships you encounter that you're aiming to sink, the actual names of ships that sank in the war, felt pretty dark. I don't really know how I feel about that, because at very least, they, to some extent, educate. I learned some things about the war and the way it was done that I didn't know before. But the fact that they don't really take an emotive stance on it, I'm not sure how I feel about that. That you're allowed to kind of engage with it and just dispassionately roll the dice and celebrate every time you sink however many tons of ships, and then your success is based on how many tons you sink. I really don't know how I feel. I think that's pretty bad. It's pretty nasty. But maybe
I,
maybe I'm
I
wrong.
well, that's your opinion. So you obviously you're fully entitled to it. But I do personally. I know how I stand. I don't think it's wrong at all. I think it's fine. Um, I think games are a really safe way to look at, history like that. It's going back to Labyrinth. I think it would be really interesting to get a better understanding of the events and the motivations that people would have had in that time by exploring those mechanisms. And by doing it in a way that is not emotive, it also makes it replayable. And with repeated plays comes better education of the subject matter, because like you said, it feels like it's factual, even though it may not be entirely historically accurate. It is somewhat handled with, well, it's definitely handled with greater care than those other sort of Euro style games that we were talking about that that don't pay any attention to the theme whatsoever. If you were to play through Mombasa, for example, has an extremely problematic theme, and it's not explored in any meaningful way whatsoever. And then if you compare that to playing a war game, at the very least, with repeated plays, you may become interested in subject matter and look more into it. And I think in the Golden Circle is a perfect setting for that type of exploration of a theme, in my opinion.
I can totally see where you're coming from, and I couldn't agree more that games like Mombasa or Puerto Rico, to me, I've really started to come around on the idea of thinking that at worst they're for people who want to experience a power fantasy as a slave owner or something like that, but even giving them the benefit of the doubt there and just saying that, well, it's an interesting theme. I think that if it's not related to the mechanics, then or the narrative, then it's just lazy design. It's a bad choice. I think that's where I stand with that. With regards to the war games, I just the worry for me with the specific example I played was how it glorified to some extent the actions of the naval of the submarine sinking however many tons, and the awards you get, the things you're motivated by, are medals of war. And at no point did it kind of, I mean, obviously for me playing it, already going in with the predisposition that I have on thinking how war is horrible and nasty and abhorrent, I was able to kind of take a meta step to that. And I get that that's a lot of the player's responsibility, and I'm sure most players would do that. But it just feels like if that's not somehow mechanically or narratively explicit in the game, it's kind of giving free reign to just be like, yeah, let's just enjoy the. And I know I sound like a sort of, I don't know what the non-violent equivalent of a prude would be, but it did kind of give me pause to think when it was mentioning real, actual names of things. But maybe that was the intention, and maybe I'm not giving enough credit. I don't know.
Well, let's say when we're not talking about Silent Victory at the moment, so let's just say you really enjoyed the game and you came back and you played it again and you learnt some other ship names and you decide to look them up. At the very least, it gets you interested in history. I don't think the games are there to. They have a different objective to this War of Mine, where it's to try and make you take a stance. I think it's more to try and get you. Well, first of all, it's to be an interesting game, but the secondary objective of historical games is to be interesting for people who are fans of history. And what I often see is that people who play war games are more respectful of those that have lost their lives in war than probably the average person who doesn't take an interest in these kind of games. So I think they obviously do some good, and I think I like. First of all, I like them. So there's that. But maybe bias that I have. But yeah, I think they're a really safe space for you to look at your history. And I think when you said, oh, it glorifies this, or it glorifies that, or that's your motivation you have as a player. I think that's interesting that you can see how quickly wars can motivate you to do things that you wouldn't normally do. Like talking about it from a non solo experience. I remember the first time I played Twilight Imperium, and I was sat next to yourself, Scruffy, and I remember we had this kind of arms race along our sort of neutral border that we agreed upon, and I felt like I really got an idea of how it must feel to lead a big army, and it didn't feel very good. It felt scary, and I think yeah, games are a perfectly safe area for you to explore these type of things, and yeah, I don't think it's a problem at all. So I think maybe we'll have to agree to disagree on that one. But
well, no, I'm not sure where I stand. Is definitely the thing. I think I need to play a lot more of them, and I need to, do a bit more soul searching on it. I really don't know.
It's not for everyone, but I do think you said there were two different types of games. I think there are three. There are the games where the theme is there to educate you on a social side of it. There are games where it takes a problematic theme instead to educate the history side of it.
I think it definitely, to some extent, I think falls into the broad category I was saying about the ones where they link the tone to unpack the social issue. I think the argument there is that they're at least making the historical references to it and saying, this is the specifics. That is in a lot of ways unpacking the issue. It's at least shining a light on what happened, and yeah, I've got to give them credit for that. They definitely are cut above, like we say, games that just have the theme with no reference to it. No, I mean sometimes it's just bizarre that they have those themes in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're not condemning people who play the games I also really enjoy. I mentioned Mombasa. It's actually in my top 30 games of all time. I really love the mechanisms. I think it's really interesting gameplay. So absolutely not being preachy here in any way, and I hope it hasn't come across that way. We're just trying to have a discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I just wish it was a different theme. Like, I don't know. I mean, the mechanics in Mombasa are great. One of my all-time favorite mechanics. I love how you go up the different tracks and how you move on the boards and stuff. But I just wish it was not slavery.
Yeah, and how do you feel about so I mentioned earlier I said very broadly, do you think games are a good way to explore these themes and to, help educate people on social issues rather than just being fun? And obviously, it generated all this discussion, but I don't think I got an answer. How do you feel about games as an educational tool for these kinds of issues? Do you think it is a good, do you think that it can be done in a tasteful and effective way?
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is if you use these themes in your game, then it's kind of beholden to you to make them an educational thing, and that is absolutely a. I mean, any form of expression is great. You should totally do it. Yeah, absolutely. Is my answer.
Do you think it is possible to cross the line where no matter how educational you're trying to be, it's just not okay to make a game about that subject? Do you think there is a line that can be crossed? And if so, where would you draw it?
I don't think I'm qualified to draw it as a white man, really, but I think it's all about just trying to avoid appropriation, I guess, isn't it? And that's why I think games like uh, Puerto Rico and Mombasa and stuff fall down is that they use the theme. They almost they kind of exploit the theme without ever really acknowledging that they're using that theme, and it feels very problematic to me. So I guess the line would be a lack of self awareness, right?
Mm. But as we've already said, that wouldn't stop us from playing those games. So why do you think that is? Do you think the fact that there's been so much time passed since those events that it makes it kind of not okay, but easier to swallow because it's not in our lifetime. It's not even in our grandparents' lifetime, for example.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because I feel like the effects from games like this are still very much in the present. And I feel like games that deal with slavery that are more along the ancient era and things like games in ancient Rome and stuff are much less problematic because the effects aren't as readily impactful. But there's so few generations between the slavery represented in more modern in those more modern examples that I feel like I obviously am able to just kind of ignore the theme and put it to one side and engage with the game and the mechanics. But I can quite see how other people might not be able to, especially those who have been directly impacted by the horrors of slavery and the effects it's still having in terms of the wealth divide and all the other numerous social issues it's caused. I mean, do you feel the same way, or
I guess I do. Yeah, I guess I do.
because to
Um,
say it was a different time and oh well, slavery was okay then, but we don't have slavery anymore. It's I feel like really a weak source thing to say. Like the effects are still absolutely prevalent. I mean, you just have to look at what's going on at the moment. We're currently it's the 12th of June today, and we've got all this stuff happening, which I'm sure will still be going on when this podcast comes out. It's hugely relevant. Of course, it is.
okay. Um, All right. I think that's really interesting. So, final thoughts on this war of mine. Would you recommend the game?
Yeah, yes, but only if you're wanting to make yourself miserable about war and how bad it is.
I probably wouldn't recommend this war of mine, just for the fact that although it executes what it's trying to achieve really, really, really well, but in order to do that, it is quite tedious to flick through all the cards and pages. And apart from some key points in the game where the story really came to life, largely I was just a little bit bored. So no, I probably wouldn't recommend this war of mine. It is obviously based on a video game, so maybe it's worth playing that instead. But yeah, please don't hate me and do take my opinions with a pinch of salt. It was my first and only time playing the game. I think that's enough on games that aim to educate and games that handle problematic themes. Thank you for sticking with us, because we did touch on some difficult issues there, and everything we said obviously was our own opinions. I'm sure we brought up lots of interesting topics. So if you do want to write in about it, you absolutely can. And I think that's a good segue into the portion of the show where we talk about the responses we got and people who've written to us from last episode. So, as always, Scruffy hasn't seen these. I handle the correspondence, and we're going to go through those now. So, first of all, in response to episode 3, which was about Mage Knight, we heard from a chap called Dan. So Dan wrote in a number of different things. So first of all, he says, hey guys, really enjoying the show. Have a couple of thoughts after listening to episode 3. One is he needs to play Mage Knight again. 2 is Monopoly can be fun. So I don't know if you remember, but I did actually bring up Monopoly when I was talking about house rules. But moving on, carrying on with what he said. 3, the question we asked last week was, what's the most immersive solo experience you've had? So he said in response to last week's question, he actually finds the Fallout board game to be quite immersive, and it actually works best as a solo game, despite it being a multiplayer game. And this is due to the nature of the IP it's based on, as it becomes more about you playing through the story and having weird, disjointed interactions with other players. So that's what Dan said. So first of all, Dan, thank you for writing. We really appreciate that. But how do you feel about that, Scruffy?
Yeah, it's really awesome. I mean, I played Fallout multiplayer, but I've never played it solo. I can imagine it would absolutely work a lot better solo, because the way it works in multiplayer, isn't it, that you kind of come across fragments of story, and then other players carry on the story sometimes if they randomly draw the cards that you put into the deck, and it just feels a bit weird. But I can totally see how it would work better solo. Also, the way you kind of compete for reputation of the factions just felt kind of weird when I played it multiplayer. It didn't seem to make much sense. Maybe that was just my experience, but I absolutely can totally see how it would translate much better to a sort of immersive storytelling solo experience. So I'll have to check that out for sure.
And I've not played Fallout, the board game, so I don't really have much to say on that one, Dan. But in relation to your first point, yes, you should play Mage Knight again. It's
Absolutely,
awesome.
totally agree.
Whilst we are on that subject, last time we spoke about the Mage Knight tournament, we said about how we would get on. We would just finish round 2, and we said how we were about to play round 3, and we would let people know how we got on. So there's actually been 2 rounds since the last recording, so let's do it bit by bit. First of all, Scruffy, how did you get on in round 3?
So I made it through round 3 and got into round 4. It was quite a hard game. It was it was a bit of a tricky one. But then in round 4, which was the first time ever playing with the Megatropolis rules, I got eliminated because I missed a rule when I was attacking the first city. Somebody pointed it out, and so I've dropped out of that one. But I was, when I actually did the playthrough, I managed to one-shot the Megatropolis, which made me very, very happy. First time experiencing one, and I took it out in one foul blow, which felt really good.
Nice.
I used to spell earthquake with a bunch of siege attack and stuff. It was very fun.
Earthquake is really, really, really useful for a city assault, so I can imagine that worked out pretty well for you. So well done on beating it, but obviously bad luck for dropping out of the tournament. For me, so obviously, yeah, I also beat round 3. So round 3 was city level 11, which is the highest you can go up to before you have to start doing the Megatropolis rules. So yeah, that was my first time going that high. I also managed to one-shot the level 11 city. With regards to round 4, I have just started round 4. I finished the first day, and I'm starting the first night, which is the second of 6 rounds. And the game is still on the dining table. Scruffy messaged me and said, "Hey, let's do a recording now." And I said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So I've left Mage Knight on the table. It has to be finished tonight. That's the deadline. So you'll know by next episode if I've made it into round 5. But I'll be honest, things aren't looking good. It's been a tough start.
Did we have any other correspondence?
Yes, we did. So we also had someone reach out. This person's name is Kendall. Now, Kendall actually will be joining us for the next episode. Kendall we actually know, and he is a game designer. So we're going to be talking about his game in the next episode. So if you have any questions about what he's written in, feel free to respond, because I'll make him answer for you. But yeah, Kendall writes in saying, "Great job on the show, guys. Good job so far." Right, the crux of the email is about difficulty in solo games, which is what we covered in episode 2. And he said that inherently, by design, solo games are either too difficult or too easy, which is, I think, quite controversial, but he goes on to explain. He says, because like with analog gaming, you can't really do complex simulation and reaction to your actions. It mostly relies on randomness for its unpredictability. And if that randomness is really low, like in Caverna, which he used that example because we briefly spoke about in episode 2, it says then the game is a neat puzzle. And it can be just the right amount of challenge until you figure out the optimal strategy. Then, once you've got an optimal strategy, you can't lose because there's no unpredictability or challenge to it. He goes on to say most solo and co-op games are a lot more unpredictable, but it's through randomness. For example, Atoma decks, or in Pandemic, for example, the Infection deck. And that means there's more replay value, often because it's a new challenge each time. But when you're good enough and making the optimal or close to optimal moves every time, you either always win because the game can't react to your new strategy, or you lose because of the level of randomness. And if you're not able to beat the game, even when you know all the optimal moves because of that level of randomness, then the game is inherently too hard because you can lose even when you've made all of the correct decisions. That's a lot to digest there. What do you think about that?
That's really interesting. The idea of difficulty in solo game is fascinating to me. I think this War of Mine is a great example of a game that is what I guess Kendall would call too hard, that you can play completely optimally, and I mean, unless you know what all the scripts are and you know what all the outcomes are, then I suppose it would become too easy. But if you don't, you can just get horrible scripts that absolutely destroy your survivors and your chances of winning the game. But obviously that works in this War of Mine, a game where it's not designed that the aim is necessarily to win, but more to experience the story. In games like Mage Knight, for example, I think the concept of winning is important, but I think because it has a score thing, it's kind of almost infinitely replayable, and the randomness adds enough to it that it really, for me, strikes that difficulty line of being too easy or too hard right in a really nice spot. And we'll have to definitely go through it in real detail, I think, in another episode where we can talk about randomness and really get into it. But yeah, absolutely, definitely interesting food for thought. How do you feel? What do you think?
In short, he's wrong. I don't think just because you can lose by randomness, it means the game is too hard. That doesn't mean the game is too hard, because that random event could just as easily, in most cases, been something that helps you rather than something that makes you lose. I don't think that means the game is too hard. I think that means it's interesting, different every time.
I mean, the thing with that is that random event isn't something you have agency over. So I guess what Kendall's saying is that if games are meant to be a test of your skill as a player and your choices, and randomness can wreck you, then the difficulty level is too much, because it moves away from being about skill and into a difficulty based on luck, which is not something you have control over, and therefore it's not just too hard, but actually almost impossible.
I suppose. But the reason that that doesn't work in reality is because often games with that level of randomness becomes very difficult to know what the optimal move is. So in Kendall's email, he says you could make all the optimal or close to optimal moves and still lose. In those kind of games, if it's a random event, you rarely have much information on this. You don't know what the optimal move is. So it's kind of impossible to say, well, I made all the optimal choices and I still lost, because it's very difficult to know what that is. Pandemic is a specific example. It gives you a really lovely level of information. I really like Pandemic as a solo experience. I do think it becomes easier as a solo game because you're able to make rationale for both characters, or for three characters, or however many you're playing. But Pandemic actually, it's random, but because of the way the infections work, the epidemic cards work, is that you take the cards that you've already drawn from the infection deck and you put them back on top. So although that makes the game harder because the randomness is going to become more effective because it's going to hit the same cities, you also gain more knowledge of the random events that are about to happen. So often the game puts you in difficult positions where it's kind of impossible to know what the optimal move is. And although Kendall might say that means I'm right and the game is too difficult, I think that's a really lovely way of building the tension. And I think it's a tool that means the game is replayable and interesting. And I've never finished a game of Pandemic and gone, well, I lost because of this random event, and that means it's just too hard. I've never felt that way. So maybe he might be correct in principle, but I think I think a game being too easy or too hard is only a bad thing when it makes you feel like the game is too easy, too hard. And I don't know. He used Pandemic as a specific example. I've never felt that way either way. My instinct is to say I understand. It's a really interesting point, but yeah, I don't think all solo games are inherently too easy or too hard. I think that's too broad. That's too broad a brush to stroke with, in my opinion.
You're saying that the randomness and the luck, to some extent, is a factor in the decision that you make, and
Yeah,
in order to make the optimal move, you can't ignore that you might draw a random card that eliminates a character, or I mean, it's very rare that you'll get a random card that says you lose the game. That would be a game that would be too hard. But in practice, most games don't have that card. They have a card that says, oh, this is a really bad random card and you lose X, whatever it might be. But you should, as a experienced player of that game, be able to anticipate for that. For example, in Pandemic, you might draw the card that gives you the epidemic explosion or whatever, and you as the player should be responsible for that. I think Pandemic's an interesting example because you have the kind of heads up about what the randomness might be, so it really makes that a part of the factor. And I think the best games are ones that give you that kind of the tools to anticipate that randomness, whereas ones where it is just literally a card draw, especially if you haven't played the game before and you don't know what that card can be, there's no way to anticipate that, so you can't make the optimal move because you
yeah,
can't.
yeah, and Pandemic is, to expand on it even further. Let's create a specific example where an epidemic happens. You put the cards back on top, and it creates an outbreak. And you can go, well, there was no way I could have gone there. I could have got to it in time. My character was too far away. You would have chosen to move your character there. I guess in what Kendall's saying is, if you had infinite time to play the game, you would get good enough where it would be too easy, or it's too random that even if you were that good, you could still lose. And then by its very definition, it's too hard. I think that level of mastery that you would have to assume someone has to get to that point is so high that it's almost, even if you are right, even if Kendall was right, it's not very important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with that. And if you want to know more about how we feel about difficulty in board games, then check out episode 1, where we specifically cover that topic. And I think in the future we'll have to go into randomness in a lot more detail and how it affects difficulty and stuff.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. Just a small correction there, though. It was episode 2 where we spoke about difficulty in solo games.
Off the back of that wonderful feedback, the question for this week is: do you agree with Kendall's hypothesis that games are either too easy or too hard?
Too easy because they are subject to mastery and low in randomness, or too difficult because they are high in randomness and impossible to therefore master. Let us know your thoughts. It's obviously a really interesting topic, and I'm sure it's going to provoke some strong responses. And like you said, he will be on the next episode talking about his game, so we'd love to get your response to that.
Yeah, and feel free to, as always, contact us with any other responses, questions, comments, anything at all, and we will do our best to get that read out in the next episode. How can they contact us, Norm?
So yeah, we are contactable on Facebook. The links to our Facebook page are in our show notes. We're also contactable by Instagram. We are at Always Play One Podcast. You can also email us. Our email address is alwaysplayer1podcast@gmail.com. And this is one of my favourite parts of the show. We always love hearing from you guys, so don't be afraid to write in. You guys really make the show what it is.
Thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.